Hi everyone, and welcome to week 9. This week we finally arrive at a stage that all of you have been building towards across the semester: designing behaviour change interventions. Up until now, you've spent a significant amount of time understanding the problem, identifying and prioritizing behaviours, and conducting a behavioural diagnosis. All of that work is essential. We can't design any solution until all of that work is done. Intervention design sits at the very end of the deep dive phase of the method. It's the output of everything that has come before it. A helpful way to think about this is that intervention design is just the tip of the iceberg, right? It's the visible outcome, but it's only effective if it's grounded in strong evidence and insight. Before we go any further, let's clarify what we mean by an intervention. In behavioural science, an intervention is simply the strategy or the program or the initiative used to change behaviour. It's the thing you design to influence your target audience to perform your priority behaviour. Importantly, there's never just one way to change behaviour. For any given problem, there are multiple possible intervention approaches. To help us navigate these options, we often use the behaviour change wheel, which was developed by Susan Mickey and colleagues in 2011. At the centre of the wheel are the drivers of behaviour, they use COM-B, and surrounding this are the intervention functions. Now, these are broad categories of ways that we can influence behaviour. There are 9 intervention functions, and understanding these is critical for your assignment. Let's walk through the definition of each of them, as well as an example of each function based around a hypothetical household recycling challenge. Education is about increasing knowledge or understanding. An example of an education intervention would be providing informative leaflets to households on what type of waste should go into which type of bin. Training focuses on building skills and capability. So, for instance, we could develop a training game that allows people to practice recycling skills correctly and become champions. Persuasion involves using communication to evoke emotions or shape attitudes. For example, we could share images or videos of items that have been recycled and reused as something else rather than being sent to landfill to try and evoke positive attitudes or feelings about the benefits of recycling. Modelling is where we provide examples for people to imitate or copy. For example, we could identify and show influential figures to our target audience of them recycling. So we might show athletes recycling. Incentivization creates an expectation of reward. Now, this could be a financial reward or a social reward. An example of an incentivization intervention could be giving people a raffle entry to a larger prize for every week that they don't contaminate their recycling bin with non-recyclable waste. Coercion is the opposite of incentivization. It introduces expectation for a cost or a punishment. For example, we could instigate bin taping and rejections for heavily contaminated bins, or we could give out fines. Enablement removes barriers or increases capability and opportunity, and it can include providing tools, resources, or support to make the behaviour easier. Enablement is a broad category, but one example of how this function can be used could be encouraging neighbours to remind others to take the right bin out, or doing that for a neighbour who's away or sick. Environmental restructuring, as it sounds, involves changing the physical or the social environment. A classic way of using this function is redesigning spaces so that the desired behaviour becomes the default or easier. For example, we could make bins for non-recyclable waste smaller, and we can collect those bins less frequently. Restriction limits the opportunity to engage in the undesired behaviour, often through rules. So, for example, banning certain materials by introducing rules on what can and cannot be recycled at local recycling centres, or even restricting access. Now, understanding these intervention functions is the first step. The next question is, how do we choose the right functions for our behavior. And this is where your behavioral diagnosis that you've done becomes critical. Each intervention function is suited to addressing specific types of barriers. For example, if awareness of our behavior is low, then education is the appropriate function. If attitudes to our behavior are negative, persuasion could be a helpful intervention function. If skills are lacking to perform the behavior, then we need to provide training. If there are structural barriers in place, then we'll consider things like enablement or environmental restructuring. If habits are quite strong as a barrier for our behavior, we might do incentives or coercion or environmental changes. The key principle here is the alignment between the diagnosis and the function. You're trying to match them. You're not choosing intervention functions based on what seems most appealing or creative. You're choosing your functions based on what your evidence is telling you is driving your behavior and which function or functions align best to that. Another important point is that one intervention is rarely enough. Most behaviors are influenced by multiple drivers and barriers. This means that you'll typically need to make a bundle of different intervention functions. Each function addresses a different part of your problem, a different part of your behavior. And this is why large-scale behavior change, like road safety or recycling, often involves multiple strategies over time rather than just a single campaign. To bring this to life, let's walk through a real BehaviourWorks case study. The problem was contamination in curbside recycling, specifically households placing non-recyclable items in recycling bins. We narrowed this down to a target behaviour about bagged recycling. And this is where people place all their recyclables in a plastic bag before they put them in the bin. There's two possible target behaviours that were identified. One was having people use a reusable container instead of plastic bags, so they can just tip it in loose, or getting them to empty their plastic bags and place all their recycling loose into the bin, no bags in the bin. We then explored the drivers and barriers for these behaviours. Some people held incorrect beliefs. They thought that recycling was hand sorted, and so keeping things inside plastic bags were fine. Others were acting out of habit. They'd always done it this way in bags. Some were concerned about hygiene, viewing recycling as dirty. Others faced practical constraints like limited space in apartments. Using what was a much lengthier diagnosis, colleagues at BWA designed a bundle of interventions. So to tackle the incorrect beliefs, they used education and persuasion. There were materials that were developed that explained how recycling systems actually worked. For those physical barriers, they used enablement, and so this was things like provision of reusable recycling bags. For those hygiene concerns, there was a lot of practical guidance, including tips like keeping recyclables clean and washing the bags. And to tackle habits, incentives and feedback were used. So positive reinforcement such as congratulatory tags and corrective feedback when it wasn't quite right. When tested, some interventions were more effective than others, but importantly, no single intervention function would have addressed all of the barriers in this case study. It was the combination of intervention functions that really made the difference. The key takeaway from this week is that effective intervention design, it's not about creativity alone. It's about correctly matching your behavioural diagnosis to your intervention choices. If you understand why a behaviour is happening, then you can design interventions that are far more likely to change it. There's alignment happening. Next week, we'll continue building on this by looking at how we test and evaluate interventions in the real world. I'll see you then.